Every night in silence they walked the halls, guarding shadows. Hey there, it's good to see you. Before we begin, where are you watching from tonight? Are you in your room, curled up in bed, or just resting your eyes on the sofa? What time is it for you? Drop it in the comments. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from and what you're up to, whether it's 9 p.m. or 3 in the morning. Whether you're working late, trying to fall asleep, or just letting your mind drift. I'm glad you're here. Now, settle in. Turn on the fan. Get cozy under your blanket, and let's wander into a story that moves slowly, almost like a dream that never ends. Because tonight, we're going to talk about something that almost no one remembers. It's quiet, it's slow, it's strange. It's about the people who spent centuries guarding rooms that were completely empty, walking softly, watching nothing, whispering to no one. And somehow, they mattered. So now, let's begin. They were called night watchers, and for most of their lives they never saw war, never caught a thief, never chased a shadow. And yet every night they tied on their belts, lit their small lanterns, and walked the halls of places so grand, and yet so utterly silent, that even a footstep could feel like thunder. In the marble corridors of Baroque palaces, in the stone-cold keeps of medieval castles, in the tiled villas of forgotten queens, there were watchers. Men, and sometimes women who were paid a small coin, handed a single key and told, "You are responsible for everything." Even when everything was absolutely nothing. A long hallway filled only with echoes, a velvet chair no one sat in, a door that hadn't been opened in 50 years, and yet every hour, every night, the watchers would make their rounds, clicking their boots gently against the floor, touching the cold doorknobs to make sure they were still locked, listening, not for intruders, but for silence. Silence was their music. Stillness was their reward. Sometimes they wore thick cloaks. Other times just a thin tunic, shivering under the moonlight that slanted through a tall window. The halls were dark, sometimes candlelit, sometimes lit only by the stars. There was no rush, no noise, no danger, only time. Endless, slow time. In many places like old Vienna or Palermo, there were records, dusty ones, of men who walked the same corridor every night for 40 years. They memorized each creak in the floor, each crack in the wall, each shadow the moon made through the stained glass, and they watched, and still, nothing changed. But that was their job, not to fight, not to interfere, but to be there, to exist, in the emptiness. And maybe in a way, that made them more loyal than the guards on the battlefield, because anyone can fight when the trumpet sounds. But to watch patiently when there is nothing, that takes a different kind of strength. A quiet one. Let's go deeper now. Imagine the castle of Sainte-Foy in southern France. The royal family had left. The courts had dissolved. The tapestries still hung but faded. And in the heart of it all, a man named Jacques still walked the halls. He was 72. He had no sword. Just a brass key and a silver whistle he hadn't blown in 20 years. Each night, he began his rounds at 10. Past the dining room where no food had been served since his own father was a child. Past the ballroom with dust dancing in the moonlight. Past the door that led to nowhere, where a queen once kept her collection of ivory fans. He would stop at certain doors, not to open them, but to press his fingers gently on the handle. It was cold, still locked, still safe. That was enough. He didn't hum. He didn't speak. His only companion was the sound of the wind. Sometimes he'd hear something, not a threat, just the memory of a place breathing, the long sigh of a wooden beam adjusting in the cold, the faint click of a mouse in the pantry, the flutter of old drapes moving when no one had touched them. None of it scared him. He knew the building better than he knew most people. He trusted it, and it trusted him, because that's what it means to be a night watcher. to build a relationship with stillness, to become friends with emptiness. They say once, during a storm, the ceiling leaked in the old library. Jacques didn't panic. He simply placed a copper bowl beneath the drip and returned 3 times during the night to empty it into the flower bed outside. No one ever thanked him, but he didn't need thanks. His reward was the slow return of quiet after the drip had stopped. That's what he waited for, and night after night, he found it. In St. Petersburg, during the 1700s, the Winter Palace held more windows than soldiers. Its halls stretched so long that light from one candle barely reached the next wall. And yet, every night, a watcher walked them. He was called Mikhail, not a soldier, not a servant, just a man who was born quiet and stayed that way. He walked past the ballroom with gold trim on the ceiling, past the portrait gallery filled with eyes that never blinked, and into the glass corridor where the moonlight made the floor glow like frozen milk. Mikhail had a pattern: 12 halls, 3 staircases, and one stop by the statue of a forgotten emperor. He'd pause there, not to pray, but to blink slowly and let his eyes rest. He always said, though no one ever asked him, that the statue blinked back if you stood still long enough, not in a scary way, just in the way old things do when they know you've been watching them for a long, long time. Sometimes Mikhail would leave a note, folded into the shape of a triangle, placed on a silver tray outside the steward's room. The note said things like, "Hall C, curtain fallen," "Blue room, candle missing," or simply, "All quiet. Good night." No one ever replied, but the tray was always empty the next night, and that was enough. Mikhail never raised his voice, never sounded an alarm, even when once, just once, a stray cat wandered into the west chamber and knocked over a vase. He cleaned it, replaced the vase with one from storage, and sat with the cat until it fell asleep in the folds of his cloak. He told no one, because to be a night watcher wasn't about reporting everything. It was about preserving everything, not just with rules, but with reverence. In Prague, during the age of candlelight and horse-drawn carts, the old castle had watchers too. But here, the rooms were haunted not by ghosts, but by memories. There were watchers who had walked the same hallway as their fathers, some who knew the creak of the 3rd stair as a kind of lullaby. One watcher, Tomas, was known to close his eyes during his shift, not out of laziness, but because he said the building spoke more clearly when he wasn't looking. He'd say, "You don't need to see the silence, you just need to listen to it." And he did. He listened to the rafters shift above his head, to the scratch of ivy on the outer stone walls, to the deep hollow groan of a doorframe swelling in winter. He never wrote reports. He simply told the next watcher, "Everything's in place." And somehow, it always was. Sometimes, people would ask, what if something happens? What if a thief comes in? What if a fire breaks out? But that was the secret of the watchers. It wasn't their job to fear. It was their job to be there, to walk slowly, to notice gently, to treat each room like it still mattered, even if no one stepped foot in it anymore. Because every room has a memory, and every watcher becomes part of it. When Thomas died, they found his boots, still warm, placed neatly by the door. His lantern was polished. His last round was complete. And by the window where he used to pause, there was a folded paper with a single word: still. In a quiet wing of the Spanish royal court, where ivy covered the windows and dust floated endlessly in the shafts of morning light, there was a room called La Sala del Silencio, the room of silence. It had no furniture, no rugs, no portraits, only pale stone walls and a narrow arched window that never opened. And yet, every night, a man named Esteban would unlock its great oak door, step inside, and stand motionless for exactly 15 minutes. Not 10, not 20. Always 15. He wore gloves, even in summer. He carried a lantern, but never raised it. And when he left the room, he bowed, just slightly, before turning the heavy key in the lock. He never said why. Esteban had watched over that one room for 37 years. He had no other assignment. His quarters were modest: a cot, a kettle, a comb, and a book of psalms. But every evening, just before midnight, he'd put on his long brown coat, lace his boots tightly, and walk with quiet reverence to that one doorway. Some believed the room had once held a relic. Others said it was used for royal meditation. But Esteban never confirmed anything. He simply watched it. He said the room taught him things: how stone settles in the cold, how the air thickens in August, how even emptiness can hum if you listen long enough. There was one winter, especially cold, when frost appeared on the inside walls of La Sala. Most believed the palace's heat had simply failed in that wing, but Esteban believed the silence had grown colder, as if the room itself was remembering something. One night during that same winter, Esteban entered to find a single feather, pale, curled at the edge, lying in the exact center of the room. No bird had entered. No draft had blown. He picked it up, held it in his gloved hand, and set it gently on the stone sill beneath the arched window. The next night, it was gone. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell anyone. He simply looked at the floor and whispered something that no one ever heard. Years later, when Esteban died, they buried him with the same brass key he had turned for nearly 4 decades. And in the archives of the royal household, beneath a list of kitchen staff and court musicians, his name was written in small, careful script. Esteban Leon, watcher of the silent room, duty completed, no incidents. And still today, if you walk the old hallway just before midnight, some say the door to La Sala del Silencio creaks slightly, as if waiting for a man who no longer walks those halls, but who never truly left them either. In the northern reaches of Denmark, long before street lamps or electricity, there stood a forgotten manor house called Grey Fen Hall. It was not grand like the palaces of kings, nor holy like the homes of monks. It was simply old, built of dark stone and narrow windows, perched between a salt marsh and a winding road that no longer appears on maps. No one lived there, not anymore. The family who once filled its rooms had vanished, faded into history, their portraits left behind with faces scratched or faded by time. But the building remained. And so did the night watcher. His name was Elias, and he walked the empty halls of Grey Fen for 51 years. No one asked him to. No crown paid him. No lord commanded it. He simply did. He had been a young servant once, when the last of the Grey Fen family still lived inside its walls. He remembered the laughter of children that echoed up the stairwell, the clink of crystal glasses in the dining room, the sound of a piano in the evenings, drifting out from the west parlor. But one by one, the family members left. Some moved away, some died, some simply disappeared. And when the front doors closed for the final time, Elias remained. He did not leave. He did not claim ownership. He did not open the windows or bring in new furniture. He simply took the brass key from the hook by the servant's door, and every night as twilight slipped into the marsh, he made his rounds. He walked in slippers, not boots, soft-soled so he would not wake the house. In the candlelit dark, he moved like a memory. He paused at every door, his fingers hovering an inch above the doorknob, not to turn it, but to feel the cold stillness on the metal. He stood in rooms that had not been entered in decades. His lantern held low, casting shadows across wallpaper faded to the color of old bone. In the upstairs hall, there was a crack in the window. He checked it each night with a strip of silk, held gently across the glass to feel for any draft. And if he found one, he would press a dried sprig of lavender into the crack. He said it kept the wind from forgetting where it came from. On the 3rd floor, in a room with no furniture at all, he once found a small seashell resting in the corner. He had never placed it there, and the room had no windows, but he left it untouched. He said that some things came through the walls when the night was deep enough. Elias never wrote letters. He never locked the front gate. He never kept time with a clock. He listened for the house itself to tell him when to begin, when the wind turned sharp. when the floor shifted beneath his feet just so, when the lanterns began to flicker, even before they were lit. That was when he began. He kept his robes folded in the same wooden chest by the kitchen. He warmed his hands at the same stone hearth that had not held a fire in 20 years. He boiled water in an iron kettle, not to drink, but to fill a small clay bowl he placed outside the cellar door, for the spirits, he once said, smiling. When asked why he stayed, when the manor was crumbling, and the nights were long, he replied softly, "Because someone must remember the silence." He believed that memory lived in the floors, that footsteps worn into the wood could echo backward if you walked slowly enough. He believed the ghosts of laughter, the shadow of sorrow, and the rhythm of breathing that once filled a bed could all be felt again if one simply waited. And he waited. Every night. Through winters where snow buried the front gate, and summers where vines clawed their way into the cracks of the stone. He lit a single candle at dusk, and when it burned out, he'd sit in the dark, hands folded, eyes closed, until the wind shifted, and it was time to begin again. When Elias finally passed, alone in his small servants' quarters, the house was silent, utterly still, but nothing inside had been stolen. Nothing was broken. Everything remained. A historian came years later to inspect the manor. They found dust and cobwebs and silence, but also folded linens, polished doorknobs, shoes placed neatly in a corner, a broom resting by the hearth, and on the mantel of the great hall, a note written in the softest handwriting, barely legible, tucked into a dried lavender bloom. It said only, "I watched." That was enough. And beneath it, the date, and the initials, E.L. today. No one lives at Grey Fen Hall, but locals say that on certain nights when the wind is quiet and the marsh is still, you can see the flicker of a candle through the upper window, just for a moment, as if someone inside is watching, waiting, walking softly through the emptiness again. Far in the east, beyond the olive groves and limestone terraces of old Anatolia, there once stood a palace carved not from stone, but from silence. It was known simply as the House of 12 Doors, a structure built in the desert by a forgotten sultan, whose name no longer appears in books, and whose lineage dissolved before the first printing press ever reached his land. This house, with 12 doors and no windows, sat at the edge of a dried-up river. The only way in was to knock 3 times on the outer door with a ring made of pure copper. But no one knocked anymore, not for centuries, and still. Every night without fail, a watcher arrived before the moon rose. His name was Haroun. No title, no family name, just Haroun. He did not live in the house. He lived in a clay hut beyond the dunes, with nothing but a mattress made of camel hair and a single painted bowl that had belonged to his grandmother. At dusk, he would rise without alarm. He would bathe with a ladle of cold water, fasten his sandals, and walk the same quiet path across the sand. No footprints lasted in the wind, but somehow he always knew the way. Inside the House of 12 Doors, the air was dry, still, and thick with memory. Each of the doors opened to a room with no furnishings, no occupants, and no sound. And yet Haroun visited each one in order, never out of sequence. The first room held a single clay jar. He would wipe it with a cloth. The second room had a shelf with 12 small indentations, like where vases used to stand. He would run his fingers across them one by one. The third room had nothing, just silence so deep it pressed against the chest. He would bow here, always. No one knew why. The fourth room had a cracked mosaic on the floor, a pattern of spirals and stars. Haroun believed it whispered at night, not with sound but with pressure beneath the feet. The fifth room had once housed a great mirror, now gone. Still, he cleaned the wall as though it remained. By the time he reached the 12th room, the air was colder. Not cold by weather, but by absence. It was the only room where he lit a candle, a small one with black wax, which he let burn down completely each night. He never spoke, never sang, never prayed aloud. But when the candle finally sputtered out in the 12th room, he would rest his palm against the door as if to say, "I was here." He told no one what the rooms meant. Perhaps not even he knew. But he believed that memory resided in routine, that to do the same quiet act night after night was a kind of worship, a reverence for things long lost. He once told a passing trader, the only man who ever asked him, that the house had a heartbeat. "You just have to be still enough to hear it," he said. And he could hear it. When the wind stopped, when the jackals were silent, when even the stars felt distant. He said the house exhaled, no more than once a year. But he had felt it. When Haroun passed away, his sandals were found neatly placed outside the first door, the candle already burned in his hand. Wax cooled, wick blackened. The house never locked again, but no one dared enter, because the watchers believed in waiting, and his waiting had been complete. Today the House of 12 Doors still stands, cracked, half buried in sand, unknown to maps, but not forgotten. Sometimes at dawn, travelers speak of the faint smell of burned wax drifting through the air, or the shape of sandal marks pressed into the dust, marks that vanish before the sun rises, and those who know simply nod and say softly, "Haroun has already come and gone." In a quiet corner of old Bavaria, nestled between pine-covered hills and thick patches of wild mist, stood a solitary watchtower known only by a name whispered in the records of the church, the Tower Without a Bell. It had no real purpose, no guards, no flags, no staircase wide enough for a nobleman's boots, just a narrow spiral of stone and a single wooden chair at the very top, placed against a wall where a bell had once been intended, but never hung. And yet, for nearly 120 years, the tower was never empty after sundown, because there was always someone inside, a watcher. Each one lived alone, in the stone cottage just beyond the trees, and every evening, regardless of the weather, whether rain whipped across the valley or fog swallowed the hills, they walked the winding path toward the tower, not in uniform, not in armor, but in wool cloaks and soft shoes, holding a lantern, carrying nothing else. Inside, they climbed, slowly. The steps were narrow, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, so many feet that had made the same quiet ascent every single night for over a century. At the top, they would sit, in that same wooden chair, in front of the same arched opening in the wall, where the bell had never been, and they would watch. Not for enemies, not for smoke or signals, but simply to witness. To witness the nothingness, the curve of distant hills as night crept across them, the slow turning of stars above the pine trees, the flickering lanterns from the distant village, blinking in and out as people closed their shutters for the night. Some watchers stayed for an hour, some for 6. None were timed, none were paid. They were chosen, passed down like quiet songs or old keys. A father would teach a son. A grandmother would pass the duty to a niece. And so the line continued. The story goes that the first watcher was a shepherd, a man who had once seen smoke on the hill and warned the village. He was thanked, but he never stopped watching after that, even when there was no more smoke, even when the hills remained silent for years. He returned every night, and so began the line of watchers. The bell was never hung, because no one ever rang it. The tower didn't need sound. It only needed presence. In one worn leather journal, found beneath the floorboards decades later, a watcher named Clara had written a single sentence over and over again. "I am here. That is enough." On certain nights when clouds were low and the stars were hiding, watchers would bring a candle and place it in the hollow where the bell should have been, so the light could drift out softly into the dark, not as a warning, but as a reminder that someone was still awake, that someone was still watching. One winter, the watchtower door was found open, snow inside. No footsteps. No watcher. Some believed the last in the line had passed away quietly. Others said she had simply walked farther up the hill and never returned. But after that, the village changed. Children began leaving small bundles of bread near the base of the tower. Lanterns were hung on trees during the solstice, and once a year, on the longest night, they would light a candle at the old tower's mouth, just one, and leave it burning until dawn. Not for fear, not for ceremony, but because they remembered that there had been watchers. And those watchers had seen everything, even when there was nothing to see, even when no one else noticed. They had kept the night company. They had been present in the purest sense of the word. And now, when wind moves through the hills like breath, when the sky is still, and the candle in the tower flickers without flame, some say the chair is not empty. Not really. It's just waiting. In the lowlands of eastern Saxony, just beyond a bend in the river Elbe where the fog clings like memory, there once stood a grand hall, not a castle, not a palace, but a place known only to a few as the House of the Second Candle. It was wide and flat, with long corridors made of oiled wood that creaked softly when the wind brushed past the shutters. No one lived there. Not in the way people lived in homes or estates. There were no bedrooms, no kitchens. Just an entrance room with a polished bench, and two candles on either end of a long table that stretched toward a high glass window. The first candle was always lit at sunset. The second was never touched. This was not a place of ritual, but of quiet agreement, a place kept, maintained, watched over, but not spoken of in public. The watchers who came here were unlike those in towers or forests. They wore no cloaks, carried no lanterns. They came alone, usually without telling anyone. They would enter silently, light the first candle, and sit. They were not guarding anything. Not exactly. They were witnessing something very old, something most people had forgotten. The records, those that survive, suggest that the house was originally built in the 1500s as a gathering hall for a group of stewards who had sworn to observe certain signs of stillness. These signs weren't storms or omens. They were smaller, more delicate. Like when the same bird appeared at the same window 3 nights in a row, or when the wind stopped moving for exactly 13 minutes, or when all the forest dogs in the villages surrounding the house refused to bark. They would record these events in long slanted handwriting across black-bound ledgers, but not to predict anything, not to warn, just to observe, to write them down so they wouldn't be forgotten. The candle at the start of the table was lit to mark the moment of watching. The second candle, at the end, was never lit, because as the watchers believed, that second candle belonged to whatever was being watched. It was a strange philosophy, one that required patience, detachment, and a deep respect for what was unseen. The hall remained quiet through centuries. Even as kingdoms changed, borders redrew, and steam replaced horses on the old eastern rails. The house was never torn down, not because it was hidden, but because no one ever thought to use the land. It was as if the world politely avoided it. People who visited said the building smelled faintly of candle wax and pine bark. The air inside was still, even when storms raged outside. And no matter the time of year, the first candle never seemed to burn out. It would melt, it would flicker, but its light always lasted just long enough, until the watcher stood, silently bowed their head, and left. They never touched the second flame. They never tried to guess what it meant. The final entry in the black ledger reads, "The flame is no longer ours, it waits." And after that, no one came again. But the house still stands. Locals say if you walk near the river bend during heavy mist, especially in the last hour before sunrise, you may see a soft golden glow behind the high glass window. Not flickering, not moving, just waiting, like a second candle that never needed to be lit. Because it was always already there. In a quiet valley in northern Bohemia, where the trees hum low in the evenings and the stones along the paths are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, there was once a bell tower with no bell. It rose gently above the forest canopy, built from pale limestone and bound with moss-covered iron braces. No doors, no stairs. Only a narrow spiral carved into the inner wall, climbing upward in perfect silence. They called it the Listening Tower. The name didn't appear on maps. There were no stories passed down in the usual sense, no tales around the hearth or bedtime legends whispered to children. And yet, nearly every village elder within a day's walk knew of it. They might not speak of it often, but when asked, they would nod quietly and say only, "It's still there, waiting to be heard." No one lived inside the tower, but for nearly 200 years it was always occupied. Each day, one person from the nearby valley would ascend its winding path at dawn and descend at twilight. They didn't carry instruments, no notebooks, no books. They carried only themselves. Their purpose was to listen. To sit quietly against the stone wall, just beneath the empty arch where the bell might have once hung, and simply remain still. Not to meditate, not to pray, but to allow the silence to speak. Each watcher of the tower, and yes, they too were called watchers, had a journal, but the journals remained at home, untouched until their return. Inside, they would write a single line, sometimes just a word, sometimes a sound, sometimes nothing at all. Some of those journals survive today. In museums, forgotten library drawers, or folded into private collections where they're mistaken for poetry or nonsense. A few lines from one watcher's entries still echo softly when read aloud. The air cracked once just before noon. A low breath from the trees below. Silence heavier than stone today. The wind remembered something. What exactly they were listening for was never clear. There was no sign to wait for, no prediction or prophecy, no threat. The silence was not empty, it was attentive. And so the watchers learned to attend to it in return, to meet it each day without expectation, to match its patience. Generations passed. Some watchers trained their children. Others passed the task to students, to neighbors, to those who had known grief or long silence in their own hearts. Eventually, though, the watchers became fewer. The road that led to the tower grew wild with creeping vines. The steps wore down to smooth, slanted curves. The valley itself thinned with time. Homes abandoned, shutters sealed, stone walls covered in ivy. And then finally, one morning, there was no watcher. The tower remained empty and still. Its stone spiral swallowed in shadow, the arch above catching the wind as it once had for centuries. Yet if you walk there even now, on the quietest day after the rain has stopped and the birds have gone still, you may hear it. Not a bell, not a song, but something softer, deeper, like the memory of a sound not yet made. And for a moment, the world around you might feel like it's waiting, just as it always was. And just as someone long ago had once listened for, far to the west of the tower, across lowland marshes and through old oak forests, where the bark runs like wrinkles on time's own skin, there was once a bridge that led to nothing. It arched gently over a river that no longer flowed, built from weathered cedar and bound with black iron nails so aged they'd begun to dissolve into the wood. The bridge had no name, no official marker. It was absent from charts and ignored in land records, and yet it was always there. Locals avoided it, not out of fear, but out of something subtler, a kind of respect. It wasn't that the bridge was unsafe. Its structure, though centuries old, remained solid. No slats missing, no ropes frayed. It was simply uninviting, not in the sense of menace, more like the way a closed door feels when you know you weren't meant to enter. But there were always a few who crossed it, not often, not in groups, always alone, and never more than once. They didn't return changed, not visibly. They didn't speak of it, not even when asked. Some would simply pause, glance out a window and say something like, "You wouldn't believe how still it gets out there." The bridge led to a glade, A flat, open circle in the woods, precisely 33 paces across, as if carved into the landscape with exacting care. Nothing grew in the center. Not grass, not moss, only stone. Smooth, cool, and pale, like bone under moonlight. In the middle stood a chair. It was made of the same cedar as the bridge, though untouched by weather. Polished, perfect, always dry, even after rain. There was no rope, no sign, no explanation. But everyone who came knew the same thing. You sit once, only once, for however long the stillness asks you to. Some stayed for moments, others for hours. No one ever checked a watch. Time in that space felt optional. And always, every single time, something was left behind. Not a token, not an offering, but a thought, an old memory, a question that had no words, a name long unspoken. It would slip quietly from the visitor and settle into the air like a feather on windless water. And when they stood to leave, the chair would feel different, not emptier, not heavier, just altered, as if it had taken what it was meant to take and given something in return, though no one could ever say what. Over time, fewer people crossed the bridge, not because the need had faded, but because people had forgotten where to look. The woods shifted. Paths vanished under bramble and fern. The riverbed turned to dust, and the glade remained, unbothered, complete, waiting. They say if you find the bridge now, if you walk in the early hours, before sunrise stirs the world, you might catch a glimpse of it in the corner of your eye, a curve of cedar, a line of iron, a shadow that shouldn't be. But only if you carry something quiet inside you, something you're ready to set down, because that is the only way the bridge will allow you through. And if it does, the chair will be waiting. The stillness will find you. And when you leave, if you do, you may not remember what you gave, but you'll know something else has taken its place. Something gentle, something unspoken, something that stays. In the shadow of the old monastery wall, where ivy fingers curl slowly around stone and time forgets its grip, there was a locked room no one had ever opened. At least no one remembered doing so. It wasn't hidden. In fact, it sat plainly at the end of a cloister hallway, behind a faded wooden door with a brass keyhole and hinges thick with age. But for reasons no one could explain, monks would pass it by as though it simply weren't there. The room had a name, etched into the stone above the door in Latin: Vigilia Silens. Silent vigil. No key had ever been found. Not in the abbey's archives. Not beneath floorboards. Not in any worn leather pouch tucked inside the robes of abbots long gone. Still, the room remained. And over the decades, then centuries, the story shifted, from a place of forgotten records or to a place of purpose. Not by decree, not by doctrine, but through whispers, through dreams, through the steady rhythm of walking past the door and feeling, always, the sense that someone had just stepped away from the other side. On especially cold nights, when the wind howled through the bell tower and the lanterns flickered in their brackets, some monks claimed to hear breathing from behind the door. Not harsh, not desperate, just calm, measured, as though someone were sitting in prayer or waiting for someone else to arrive. They say it began with Brother Thaddeus, an old monk with cloudy eyes and a voice like soft gravel. He'd been seen, late one night, sitting cross-legged outside the door, hands resting on his knees, eyes closed, no sound, no movement, only breath. He stayed for hours. When morning came, they found him still seated but smiling. He stood without a word and returned to his duties, lighter somehow, as though a weight had been passed on to something else. Others began to do the same, not by rule, not out of curiosity, but because it felt right. They would sit, sometimes for moments, sometimes until their candles burned out, always in silence. Some brought questions, others, regrets. Still others brought nothing at all. And yet, each one left something behind, even if they didn't know what. In time, a pattern formed. Every 40 nights, someone, always chosen quietly without prompting, would feel the pull. They would walk to the door of Vigilius Islands, kneel, and begin their vigil. It became the monastery's most sacred ritual. Unspoken, unlisted, but known. It was never explained to new initiates. And yet, sooner or later, they too would feel the pull, a soft tap inside the chest, a whisper behind the ribs, and they would go. They say the room behind the door is empty, that it always has been, no furniture, no relics. Just a single window carved high in the stone, letting in a square of pale morning light, and in that light, a shape, not a figure, not a shadow, but the suggestion of something watching, gently, not judging, not waiting, just being. Those who sit long enough say they feel it, a warmth, like a memory not quite recalled. Some describe it as a presence, others as stillness itself. But all agree on one thing: you are not alone in the vigil, even if no one else is there. One winter the door was found open. No one knew how. No one claimed it. There was no key. Inside, dustless stone, the scent of cedar, and nothing else. No candle, no altar, no writing. But on the wall, carved so faintly it was nearly missed, were 4 words: "I heard you breathe." The door was shut again. And from that day forward, no one ever tried to open it, because they understood. It wasn't meant to be entered. It was meant to be kept. And so, the silent watchers continued, not guarding secrets, not protecting relics, but holding space. For those moments when the heart, heavy with things unspoken, needs a place to rest. And in that resting is peace. Beneath the chapel, down where torchlight fades and the air smells of stone and age, there was a corridor few remembered. It wasn't hidden behind a false wall or buried by time. No, it was there, always as if waiting for someone to notice. The steps to reach it curved gently, descending past the burial chambers of abbots long past. Their names faded, their faces erased by centuries of moss and quiet prayers whispered for souls long gone. But farther down, where the damp walls wept softly, and each footfall was answered by the slow drip of water from unseen cracks, there came a passage carved in smooth arches. Simple, unadorned, endless. It led not to a crypt, nor to any room, just a walk, a stillness, and then eventually, a bench. That was all. A single wooden bench pressed gently against the wall, as though someone had dragged it there long ago for a reason they no longer remembered. The wood was dark with time, worn smooth where hands had rested, and the scent of wax still lingered in its grain, as if candles had once flickered here, though there were no holders left, no soot on the stone. The monks called it the listener's seat. No one taught that name. It wasn't in any record, but everyone seemed to know it. And those who sat there never did so twice. Not because they were forbidden, but because they didn't need to. Brother Elric was the first to write about it in his journal, a thin leather-bound book with tiny handwriting and pressed petals hidden between its pages. He was a quiet man, known for his long silences and the way he hummed softly when sweeping the southern cloister. In his final years, he wrote only 1 page about the bench. He wrote, "I sat today. I asked no questions. I said no prayers. I only listened. And in the hush, I heard the world breathe without me. I had never felt more loved or more unnecessary. And both brought me peace." After he passed, his journal was shelved in the corner of the abbey's scriptorium. No one mentioned it again. But the next winter, a young novice named Tomas descended to the passage. He didn't know why, only that his hands felt restless, and his chest heavy with something he couldn't name. He sat, and the story says he wept, not from sorrow, but from recognition, as if the silence had reached up and cupped his face, as if someone had finally looked him in the eyes and said, "I see you." He never spoke of it afterward, But the next day he rose earlier than anyone else, swept the snow from the cloister walk, and placed a single white feather on the bench's corner. Others began to do the same. Small tokens, a stone warmed in the hand, a braid of wheat, a piece of worn ribbon. Nothing valuable. Only things that had meaning once, that needed a place to be forgotten gently, and the bench became a haven not for sitting, but for letting go. They say the bench never decayed, that despite the years and damp, it remained whole. No woodworm, no rot, only a surface made smoother by 1,000 quiet surrenders. The abbey's oldest monks believed it was not the bench that listened, but the corridor itself, a place so ancient it had forgotten its own purpose, and so had become whatever the soul required. For some, it was remembrance. For others, forgiveness. And for a few, only silence. But always, it gave what was needed. Never more, never less. And when one returned up the steps and into the lantern light of the waking world, they carried something different behind their eyes. Not answers, but rest. The kind that does not shout. The kind that says, "You may stop now. It's all right. You've done enough." There was at the northern edge of the grounds a tiny gate, low, wooden, and always slightly ajar. It didn't lead to any road or formal path. In fact, most of the newer brothers didn't even know it existed. It opened into a field that was never tilled. Not for crops, not for grazing, not even for walking. It was called the Breathing Meadow. Named not for any particular sound or sight, but because it seemed to move, just slightly, with the wind, as if the grass itself exhaled now and then. No one tended it. No one cleared the thistle or plucked the wild chamomile that dotted its edge. But every evening, just as the sun dipped low behind the hills and the stone walls of the abbey cast long shadows across the ground, a single watcher would make their way down the narrow path toward the meadow. They carried nothing. No lantern, no blade, no tools. Only a thick woolen cloak, a quiet breath, and eyes softened by habit. They would stand there, at the boundary where grass met gravel, and remain, not patrolling, not observing, just staying. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes until the stars appeared, and then as gently as they came, they would turn and leave. These watchers were never named. No record listed them. But for nearly 2 centuries, a silent rotation was kept. Each night, without instruction or assignment, a monk would rise from their meal or pause during copying scripture and simply know it was their turn. The field required no guarding. There were no invaders, no threats, only wildflowers, and sometimes deer. But the watchers continued, night after night. The older monks said the field remembered something, that long before the abbey was built, before the road was carved, before even the forest crept away, the field had been a resting place, not for bodies, but for promises. The kind spoken under breath, the kind sealed by hands held in twilight. And when the world moved on, when wars came and ended, when the monks arrived and built their stone refuge, the field stayed, waiting. It didn't ask for prayers or monuments, only presence. And so, presence it was given. The youngest watcher was Brother Reynold. Just 15 when he arrived, too young to join in the chants or fasts. But one evening he wandered beyond the bell tower and found the gate open. Drawn by a pull he couldn't explain, he stepped into the hush of the meadow's edge and stood still. He didn't know the tradition. He didn't even know the name of the place. But when the wind stirred the grass and brushed his cheek, he began to cry. Quiet tears he couldn't name, couldn't stop. When he returned, he said nothing. And the next night, he returned again. By the time he took his vows years later, he had watched the field more than anyone before him. He called it the place that taught me how to be still. He would go on to copy entire books by hand, each letter precise and graceful, not out of obligation, but because it brought him the same peace the meadow did. And when his hands grew too tired to hold a quill, He trained the novices to tend the ink, but he always returned to the gate, even when he could no longer stand, even when he needed help walking. He would sit near the threshold and whisper, "Even empty things deserve to be seen." It's unclear how the Watchers began. No founder, no order, just the quiet understanding that something sacred did not always need a reason, that the act of witnessing was itself enough. To stand beside stillness, to notice the unnoticed, to give the forgotten a shape again. The breathing meadow remains untouched to this day. No stone marks it, no fence surrounds it, only the grass, the soft hum of wind, and once in a while, the sound of footsteps arriving with nothing except a quiet willingness to stay a while. Not all monks watched from outside, some watched from within. One in particular, Brother Alric, spent his life in the bell tower. He wasn't assigned there. There was no formal duty. But from the moment he arrived at the monastery, he seemed to be drawn to it. While others prayed in the chapel or copied texts in the scriptorium, Brother Alric quietly climbed the narrow spiral staircase each morning and sat just beneath the bells. He never rang them. He simply sat. At first, the others thought he was avoiding work, but over time they came to accept that Alric was different. He noticed things they didn't. He remembered the names of birds that only came once a season. He could sense when a storm would arrive, not by clouds, but by the way the wind changed direction around the stone windows. He never wrote anything down, never kept a journal, but his mind was a quiet archive. One winter, a novice asked him, "Why do you sit up here all day?" Alric didn't speak right away. He simply looked out the window at the endless gray hills, then smiled softly and said, "To know when the light changes." That was all. And for years, that's what he did. Watch the way the light moved across the stones. How it struck the east wall differently in spring than in autumn. How the color of the clouds reflected more violet on Thursdays, though no one else noticed. The bell tower became more than a place of observation. It was a vessel of quiet time, a reminder that nothing stood still, even when silence cloaked everything. On rare evenings, he would hum to himself old melodies with no name. Tunes that felt like they belonged to the stone itself. Slow, wandering tones that made the pigeons outside pause mid-flight. One night, the bells rang at midnight. Not loudly, just once. A single chime. The monks, startled, rose from their beds and gathered outside. No one had pulled the rope, no one was in the tower. And when they climbed the stairs, they found the bell still swaying gently, and Brother Alric's cloak folded neatly in the corner. He was gone. No sign of him. No footprint. No farewell. Only the folded cloak, and on the window ledge, a single feather. Long, white, edged with ash gray. After that night, the monks never climbed the tower again. They left it as it was, untouched. And yet each day, just as the sun dipped low, a chime would ring, soft, measured, as though the light itself had weight, and someone, somewhere, still watched it shift. New monks would ask, "Who rings it now?" And the older ones would only smile, tilt their heads slightly and say, "Someone who knows when the light changes." That became a kind of proverb in the monastery. A quiet blessing. To notice without interrupting. To be present without being loud. To bear witness to time and ask nothing from it in return. There were chambers in the monastery that no one truly understood. Not hidden, but forgotten. They had names, of course. Ancient ones. The room of measures, the stone quiet, the hall of turning dust. But their purposes, long erased by time and silence. Take, for example, the room of measures. It was not large, just a square space with smooth walls, and in the center, a table made of black slate. Etched into the surface were thousands of tiny lines. Not words, not numbers, just quiet marks. Each monk who entered would feel the strange pressure of stillness, a heaviness that wasn't oppressive, but made their steps slow, deliberate, like walking inside a clock that had forgotten its ticking. No one ever sat at the table. they would stand near it, breathe in the cold scent of ancient stone, and leave. The elders said the room once measured the passing of moments, not with time as we know it, but with weight. As though each second carried mass and could be weighed, examined, even listened to. And when one monk, a curious scribe named Thelon, once dared to run his finger along one of the etched lines, he felt a hum, soft and low, as though the stone beneath the table was alive and had just remembered something from centuries ago. He never did it again. The room of measures was not a place for curiosity. It was a place of presence, a place to understand, without needing to ask. Further down the eastern wing was the hall of turning dust, a long corridor filled with nothing but shelves. Empty shelves, dust-covered, unlabeled. And yet, each week a monk would sweep them, not to clean them, but to stir the dust, because the dust oddly settled in patterns, always new, always shifting. Once a visiting abbot claimed to see stars in the dust, constellations that hadn't appeared in the sky in 200 years. Another time, a novice named Elwyn noticed that the dust trails matched the pattern of a dream he had the night before. He never told anyone else. He simply returned each week and swept in silence, watching the motes swirl like memories in the half-light. No records were kept. No conclusions drawn. That was the way of the monastery. To observe, to remember, to not disturb. They were not protectors of secrets, but caretakers of forgotten stillness. One final chamber sat beneath the western cloister, accessible only through a low, uneven staircase, so narrow even the taller monks had to stoop. They called it the listening vault. It had no furnishings, no altar, no windows. Only 4 walls of smooth white limestone and a round domed ceiling that caught every whisper and returned it a breath later. Monks who entered would sit cross-legged in the center, close their eyes and speak one word. Only one. Then wait. The room would echo it back, but not as it was spoken. Changed somehow. Slower. Deeper. Older. As if the room remembered that same word being spoken 100 years earlier, and was now returning that version instead. It was a place of humility. A reminder that even words once spoken no longer belonged to the speaker. They belonged to time, to memory, to echo, and to silence. The night watchers, those gentle sentinels of stillness, did not only guard rooms and corridors, they also kept watch over time itself. Not time as marked by clocks or calendars, but time as felt. The rhythm of days folding into nights, and nights dissolving into memory. In the ancient West Wing, there was a windowless hallway known simply as the Long Quiet. It stretched for 80 paces and had no lanterns, no paintings, no markings on the walls. And yet each evening one watcher would walk its length, very slowly, from one end to the other, in absolute silence. No footsteps echoed, no breeze stirred. Just that single figure, gliding like a shadow, remembering its shape. It wasn't for protection. There was nothing to guard. It was for continuity. A way of saying, we are still here. The silence has not been broken. The long night continues. Some monks whispered that the hallway once served as a passage for those who had passed on. A corridor where old souls drifted gently through the monastery, one final time, before fading beyond the veil of the world. But the watchers didn't speak of such things. They only walked, one pace at a time. As the air thickened around them, cool and timeless. Just off the Long Quiet was a chamber they rarely entered, called the Room of Holding. Its purpose? To keep nothing. It held no objects, no scrolls, no beds, no chairs. It was empty, and yet it was always locked. Each watcher carried a small iron key, identical in shape and weight. Once a year, during the winter's deepest moon, one watcher would open the Room of Holding, not to place anything inside, but to stand at its threshold, listen for a moment, then close it again. Nothing more. Yet when they returned, there was a stillness in their breath, a quiet so deep it felt like snow falling inside the soul. The Room of Holding, they believed, held every moment never spoken aloud, every emotion buried too deeply to name, every decision unchosen, not as ghosts, not as curses, but as soft echoes waiting for peace. The watchers didn't disturb those echoes. They simply honored them, acknowledged them, let them rest. In the final corner of the monastery's north wall, just beneath the outer roofline, was a narrow walkway known as the Shadow Ledge. It overlooked nothing, just the dark slope of the mountain beyond. But on the clearest nights, when the wind stood still and the stars hung like frozen lanterns, the watchers would take turns standing there, not to look out, but to listen in, to the sound of night pressing against stone, to the breathing of an ancient earth, to the hum of nothing changing and everything continuing. They did not speak. They did not write. They only stood, wrapped in wool, surrounded by silence, becoming part of the great waiting hush that cradled the world. And if you stood far below, beneath the cliffs, you might see them. One faint figure at the edge of that high ledge, lit only by moonlight. So still they could be mistaken for a statue carved from the mountain itself. But they were watching. For us. For you. For the quiet between moments. There was a saying among the watchers, passed down not through writing, but in the way one watcher would pause before a doorway, or how they would place their hand gently on a stone wall. The dust knows. What did the dust know? It knew the shape of absence. It knew where footsteps once fell and no longer did. It knew which doors had not been opened in decades, and which had been opened every single night for centuries. Dust wasn't dirt to them. It was memory made visible. The watchers treated it with reverence. They never swept unless it was necessary. They never disturbed a settled layer without purpose, because to move dust was to move history. There was one small alcove near the very heart of the monastery that gathered more dust than any other. It had no windows, no torch sconces, no furnishings. Just a floor, a curved ceiling, and the sound of your own breath if you dared enter. Watchers called it the listening cell. No one spoke there. They didn't even whisper. They sat, still, quiet, and waited. Some said if you sat long enough, you could hear the walls remembering. The building itself would begin to hum softly, like a great sleeping beast murmuring in its dreams. But most who entered the listening cell came out with nothing to say, not because they experienced nothing, but because some stillness is too complete for words. Once a watcher who had served over 70 years passed away. He was the last of his original circle. When he died, his shoes were placed at the entrance to the listening cell, but never worn again. They were not a relic, not a symbol, just a quiet thank you. To the floor that remembered his every step. At the far eastern wall of the monastery, behind an ancient archway covered in moss, stood a peculiar structure known simply as the wind bell. It wasn't a bell in the traditional sense. There was no clapper, no rope, no sound when struck. It was a hollow stone bowl mounted high and open to the elements. When wind passed through it just right, at just the right speed and angle, it let out a tone so low and smooth, it was more felt than heard. A deep hum that rolled through the stones of the monastery, like thunder remembering its own name. Watchers never tried to control it. They didn't climb up to adjust it. They didn't measure the angle or carve the stone anew. They simply waited, and on rare nights, usually just before the season changed, when everything in the air felt like it was holding its breath, the wind bell would sing, just once. One long, deep note. Then, silence. It was said that when the wind bell rang, the watchers stood a little straighter. They blinked a little slower. And for the rest of the night, the silence felt heavier, but more sacred. No one ever knew who built the wind bell. It was older than the oldest part of the monastery, older than records. Maybe it had always been there. Maybe the monastery was built around it. But the watchers didn't question its origin. That wasn't their way. They didn't ask why silence was sacred. They didn't demand meaning. They just listened, and waited, and walked. and sat. Because they knew the truth that most people rush past. That emptiness isn't empty. That silence isn't void.
That stillness is full of things we can only hear when we stop moving.
And the watchers, they had stopped moving long ago. One of the lesser-known corridors in the monastery was known to the watchers simply as the Passage of Names. There were no plaques there, no carved stone inscriptions, no official registry, but those who walked it often said they heard names spoken softly, not out loud, not in voices, but within the quiet architecture of the air. It was a narrow hallway, lined with ancient wooden beams, each one darkened over time by centuries of candle smoke and breath. There was no breeze in the Passage of Names. Only a temperature that stayed the same, season after season, year after year. Those assigned to walk that corridor did so slowly. They would pause at odd intervals, turn slightly, as if listening to something just behind them, or just ahead. No two watchers ever described the same experience inside it. Some said they felt warmth brush their arm like a forgotten embrace. Others described a scent, like cedar or cloves or once jasmine. But most simply said they felt known, as if the passage itself remembered them, welcomed them, and gently added their name to its invisible roll call. Watchers never spoke inside the passage. It wasn't forbidden, it simply never occurred to them. What could be said that would not sound like an interruption? Near the southern edge of the monastery grounds, just beyond a crumbling fountain that had not held water for over 100 years, was a small square stone with no markings. It was known as the turnstone. Not because it was meant to be turned, but because the watchers believed that when someone stood upon it and closed their eyes, they would turn inward. It was used sparingly, only during storms, or on nights when the moon disappeared entirely. And even then, only the oldest watchers would stand on it. They would go barefoot, even in the cold, even in the wet. They would place both feet firmly, fold their hands behind their backs, and simply be still. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. They never spoke about what they experienced. Not once in 200 years. But younger watchers noticed that after standing on the turnstone, a watcher would walk slower, breathe deeper, and often they would look toward the horizon as if waiting for something only they could sense. There was one curious tradition kept alive through all generations of watchers, even as the world outside the monastery changed. At the very end of each year, on the longest night when the moon was low and the frost clung to the stone like whispered ice, the watchers would gather silently in the center courtyard. Each one would carry a candle, unlit. They would form a wide circle. No one gave instructions. There were no leaders, no signal. But one by one, in perfect stillness, they would all lower their candles to the ground, tip them slightly inward, and wait. And somewhere in the quiet, not from any person, not from any hand, a single candle would flicker to life. It would happen every year. No one knew how. No one needed to. The light would catch on the wax of the others, reflected, not lit. And for just a moment in the cold heart of winter, the watcher's circle would glow. Not bright, not showy. Just enough for shadows to dance and for silence to feel warm. Then the candles were lifted, extinguished, and the watchers returned to their paths, back to their quiet, back to their vigil, back to rooms that remembered being watched. Because long ago they understood something simple, that some rooms echo louder when filled with silence, and some people become whole only when they disappear into stillness. There was a bell in the northern wing of the monastery that hadn't been rung in centuries. It hung inside a narrow wooden turret, wrapped in thick ropes that had once been used to toll it at dawn and dusk. Now the ropes were brittle, frayed. The bell itself was green with age, its bronze skin mottled with rain and silence. But it was not forgotten. The watchers called it the listening bell, because though it made no sound, they believed it still heard everything. It was tradition that no one touched it, not out of fear, but out of reverence. They believed that silence, when held long enough, became sacred, and that the bell, left unrung, was storing every unspoken word, every unfinished thought, every breath that passed through the monastery's halls. Once a year, during the third week of autumn, a watcher would climb the creaking spiral staircase to the turret, barefoot, carrying a small piece of parchment. Not to read, not to write, but simply to sit beside the bell and listen with it. For hours they would remain there, both watcher and bell, facing the valley below, watching the wind ripple the yellowing trees, watching distant smoke curl from quiet villages, watching the horizon fade into blue-gray dusk. It was said that those who sat with the listening bell would return changed, not louder, not quieter, just deeper, like they had been hollowed a little, so something softer could fill the space. There was no record of who first brought the bell to the monastery, no name carved on its frame, no date, only a tiny symbol etched into the metal near its base, a single feather, and beside it the faintest outline of a door, not open, not closed, just ajar. The feather in the door. No one ever tried to explain their meaning. The watchers were not fond of explanations. They preferred meaning that was felt, not dissected. They would say, "Some doors open without moving. Some feathers fall upward." And that was enough. Elsewhere in the monastery was the herb room, a warm, dry chamber lined with bundles of rosemary, lavender, thyme, and a dozen other plants whose names had been forgotten, but whose smells remained familiar. The watchers rarely used the herbs for medicine. Instead, they placed small sachets of dried leaves in hidden corners of the old rooms, behind door hinges, beneath stone cracks, in the folds of old drapes, not to preserve them, not to clean them, but to anchor memory. A watcher could step into a hallway they hadn't walked in 20 years, inhale, and instantly recall who had once paced there before dawn, or where a shadow had once lingered longer than expected. Some herbs were calming, others sharpened awareness, but there was one, a deep purple flower with a bitter scent, that was said to awaken memories not their own. The watchers called it nightroot. Only the oldest among them were allowed to carry it, and only on nights when the wind blew from the east. They would crush a single petal between their fingers, hold it close, and walk silently through the oldest rooms. Not searching, just remembering. It was in this way the watchers kept the past from fading completely. They knew history was not only in books, but in walls, in air, in scent, and that to protect silence one must understand what it carries. The nightroot was never planted. It grew on its own, always in the cracks of stone, always in places touched by both shadow and light, and when it withered, it left no seeds. Only fragrance, only memory, only stillness. There was a long wooden bench beneath the west window that no one ever sat on, not because they were forbidden to, and not because it was broken, but because it belonged to the dusk. The watchers believed dusk was not a time, but a being, a quiet, drifting presence that came not from the sun's position, but from the feeling in the air, a certain stillness, a certain hush that asked not to be interrupted. And the west bench, smooth with age, its grain worn down by centuries of light, was said to be dusk's resting place. Each evening, before the sun melted into the forested hills, a watcher would gently dust the bench with a piece of soft cloth, so old it seemed more memory than fabric. They didn't clean it, only brushed away the day so the dusk could arrive unbothered. No one faced the bench directly. Instead, they sat across the room, or stood in the doorway, watching quietly as golden light pooled over the wooden slats, and shadows stretched like fingers across the stone floor. Some said they'd seen a figure sit there once, not a ghost, not a person, just a shape, the suggestion of someone who wasn't looking out the window but looking in. They said the air felt warmer when it happened, as though something vast and gentle had briefly remembered it was once human. The watchers didn't try to prove such stories. They didn't argue. They didn't doubt. They simply nodded and added another page to the invisible book only they could read. Further down the corridor, past the west wing and the bell tower, was the echo chamber. It wasn't marked. There was no sign, no latch. Just a door that always stayed half open, as if unsure whether it was supposed to be closed or not. Inside, the chamber was round, perfectly round. Its walls were smooth stone, its ceiling domed and high like a listening ear. When you stepped in, your footsteps multiplied. One step became many. One sigh bloomed into a dozen, but only for the first few seconds. Then it would all fall away like a tide pulling back, leaving only your truest voice behind. The watchers used the echo chamber for silence training. They would enter alone, stand in the center, and whisper a single word from memory. A word that meant something, but not to others, only to them. Then they would listen, not to the echo, but to what came after. The silence after the echo was different. It wasn't absence. It was presence, listening back. And sometimes, very faintly, they heard something reply. Not a word, not a phrase, just a sense, like a breath returned or a thought finishing itself somewhere very far away. One watcher, long ago, had written a single line in a margin of a forgotten scroll. The echo is not yours. It's the memory of every voice that's ever stood here. That scroll had crumbled, the ink had faded, but the line remained. Passed from voice to voice without ever being spoken aloud again. It lived in the hush between footsteps, in the way watchers nodded at one another without needing to explain anything at all, because in a place like this, where time was more echo than arrow, understanding didn't require sound, just stillness, just breath, just presence. The fourth floor wasn't haunted, not in the way stories like to suggest. There were no slamming doors, no cold drafts, no whispering voices at midnight. But still, the watchers rarely went there. Not out of fear, not really. They avoided it the way one avoids a closed book with a title you're not ready to read. The fourth floor was filled with rooms, dozens of them, identical in layout, but each one held something slightly off. A chair turned slightly too far from the table. A candle burned down to the wick yet never used. A book placed open on a shelf, as if the page itself were waiting for someone to finish reading. The rooms weren't locked. They didn't need to be. Watchers only entered when instructed, and those instructions came rarely. Only a few times a decade, a note would appear, written in faint charcoal on a folded piece of vellum, resting in the center of the night desk. The note never had a name, just a room number and a time. The assigned watcher would go alone, always alone. They would enter the indicated room, sit in the chair, and remain still until the moment passed, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for 5 hours. No explanation, no instructions, no questions afterward. Those who returned never spoke of what they saw, if they saw anything at all. They only returned to their post with the faint air of someone who had stared not at the room, but through it. There was a theory among the youngest watchers, one not written down but whispered across long shifts and quiet meals. They believed the fourth floor was not truly part of the building, that the rooms were like folds in cloth, creases in the fabric of something older than stone, that when you stepped inside, you were being observed rather than observing. They called them the measuring rooms, not because they measured space, but because they measured you. And perhaps that was why, on the rare nights when a watcher returned from room 42 or room 18 or room 7, they would pause before speaking, as though checking to make sure their own voice hadn't changed in some small, irreversible way. There was comfort in the ritual afterward. The pouring of tea, the lighting of lamps, the familiar sound of boots on wood. These small things reminded the watchers that they were still here, still grounded, still themselves. But there was always the knowledge that someday another note would appear, and someone else would go. And the rest would wait quietly, watching the hallway that led up to the fourth floor, and the silence that always followed. There were ledgers no one touched. They weren't locked or hidden away. They simply rested on the shelf behind the night desk, aged and silent, bound in dull leather that seemed to drink in the lamplight without ever reflecting it. No one could remember who started calling them the gray books, and it wasn't their color that gave them the name. It was the feeling they left in your mind after reading even a single line. Not dread, not quite. but something closer to a slow forgetting. The watchers knew better than to open them casually. A few tried, once, years ago. One watcher, young, sharp, eager to prove something, opened the third volume from the left. He read for almost 20 minutes, his brow furrowed in silence. When he finally closed the cover, he didn't say a word. He sat for the rest of his shift, not blinking, not moving, as if he had been paused. The others left him be. By morning, he stood up, put on his coat, and walked out the door. He was never assigned another watch. No one knew if he resigned, or if the building simply stopped asking for him. The gray books weren't about history in the traditional sense. They didn't record events, not wars, not names, not years. They recorded intervals. Stretches of time when nothing happened, when people vanished, not all at once, but one by one, as if the world was slowly misplacing them. The books described the absence as if it were a character. They wrote of streets with no footprints, candles that flickered but cast no shadows, locks that no longer remembered what they were protecting. Each entry began the same way. Interval began at dusk. Witness count 3. Interval ended before dawn. Witness count 1. The watchers weren't sure who wrote them. Some believed it was the original architect. Others whispered of someone else. Not a person, but a presence that the building allowed to write in its own time. The books didn't age. Their pages never yellowed. Their ink never smudged. They existed in a kind of stillness, as if untouched by dust or decay. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, a watcher would glance at the shelf and notice the smallest change. A new volume had appeared. No sound, no ceremony, just there. And someone always knew. Not because they saw it arrive, but because they felt it. The air shifted, the silence deepened, and the watchers would begin to glance at one another. Unsure who the book was for, because, although they never said it aloud, they all knew one thing for certain. The gray books only appeared after something had already been lost. The rooftop was rarely mentioned. It wasn't locked. It wasn't even hard to find. A narrow staircase tucked behind the north stairwell led directly to the top. But no one went up there after dark, not because of fear, but because of reverence. The watchers spoke of it like a church with no congregation. They called it the Quiet Crown. By day, it offered a view of the city that felt strangely removed, as though the rest of the world lay beneath a sheet of glass. You could see spires, smokestacks, the slow tumble of clouds through the sky. But by night, it transformed. There were no railings, no lights. Only stone, cold and smooth, and a breeze that never stopped. Some said that standing at the edge felt like standing at the lip of time itself. Not dangerous, not inviting, just still. The wind didn't sound like wind. It carried no whistles, no howls, just a constant hum, as if something deep below the city was gently breathing. The watchers had a rule. No one went to the rooftop alone after midnight, even if called, even if summoned. Yes, there were times someone was summoned, not by voice, not by bell, but by an instinct, a knowing. They would rise from the night chair, walk past the quiet halls, through the iron-framed door at the back of the corridor, and ascend those thin, spiraling steps. And when they came down, they never spoke of what they saw. Their faces weren't afraid. They were softened as if something had been gently explained to them, and they no longer needed to ask questions. There was one story that clung to the records, half-remembered and scribbled in a watcher's personal journal. It spoke of a single star. A star that only became visible when viewed from the center tile of the rooftop at precisely 2:03 a.m. No telescope could find it. No map would mark it. It was said to flicker once, and then vanish again for 100 years. What made the star special, the watcher had written, wasn't its light. It was the silence it left behind. A silence so perfect, so unbroken that even your heartbeat seemed to pause, out of respect. When the watcher returned, he left a note in the archive drawer. I heard nothing tonight. and it was the most beautiful sound I've ever known. Since then, others have waited, wondered, climbed the rooftop's winding path in hope of hearing that same silence. But the star never returned. Not yet. Still, every century turns, and the watchers know sooner or later it will flicker again. Beneath the rooftop, far below the chambers and corridors and archives, there was a room that almost no one remembered. Not because it was hidden, but because it had been forgotten on purpose. They called it the Echo Cellar. Its entrance was behind the oldest pantry door in the southern wing, disguised beneath 3 layers of stone and a rusted iron grate. Even if someone discovered it, it would seem like a maintenance crawl space. Nothing more than a drafty cavity with exposed beams and brittle dust. But if you crawled 10 paces in, if you pressed your hand against the leftmost wall and spoke a single word, your voice would disappear. Not echo, not bounce. It would simply be taken. No sound returned, no rustle, no whisper, no breath, only absence. Watchers told stories of the Echo Cellar in hushed voices, as if speaking of it too loudly might call it closer. They believed it wasn't a room at all, that it was a listening place, a chamber built not to store secrets, but to consume them. You didn't hide what you said there. You offered it, and whatever lived in the silence decided what to do with it. It was used only 3 times in 200 years. The first time, when the castle's builder confessed his deepest regret. The second, when a watcher broke an oath so sacred, the only way to preserve the others was to feed the truth to the cellar. And the third was never recorded, but that's the one they feared most. Because on that night, the wind never blew. The bells did not ring, and every candle, in every chamber, snuffed out in a breathless instant. When dawn came, nothing was broken. No one was missing. But every watcher had the same dream, a staircase made of glass descending into black water. And a voice, not male, not female, not human, saying only one thing. Next time, bring more. No one has opened the cellar since, but it's still there, waiting, silent, listening. And the watchers, they've learned to speak a little less and to feel a little more. Because in a place where silence listens back, some truths are better left unspoken. It was common for new watchers to feel watched, not in a paranoid way, not the way one feels eyes behind a curtain, or the cold breath of suspicion. It was gentler than that, quieter, as though the stone itself was curious, as though the castle, in all its age and weight, had noticed them. Some said the sensation passed with time. Others said it only deepened. There was one watcher, a woman named Elson, who claimed that she'd spoken to the walls, not in madness, not in fear, but in trust. She would sit at the base of the westward tower, where ivy climbed through cracked mortar, and simply speak. She'd talk about the dreams she couldn't explain, about the way time felt slower in the mornings and faster after rain. And when she finished, she'd sit in silence and wait. She told no one what she heard back. Not until her final watch, 47 years after her first. She left behind only one journal. And on the last page, written in ink barely darker than dust, were just 6 words. The stones remember more than we. No signature, no date. The tower where she used to sit was closed the following winter. Not for safety, but for stillness. It became known as Elson's Hollow, and though no guard was posted there, no watcher approached it after dusk. Once a year, on the longest night, a candle is left at its base. No one knows who lights it, but it always burns clean. No wax spills, no flame gutters, just steady gold in endless dark. And the watchers, those few who pass by in silence, sometimes feel that warmth for hours after they've gone. As if the tower remembered them, as if the quiet itself had a heartbeat. There were rules, old ones, passed down not in books, but in gestures, in pauses, in the way one looked at the hallway before stepping through. A watcher never whistled. Not once. Not even out of boredom. Whistling, they said, could wake things better left asleep. The origin of that belief was unclear. No one had ever admitted to testing it. But it was a rule followed with quiet reverence. The silence of the night was not empty. It had a presence and a pulse. Some believed the castle had moods. One hallway felt grumpier than others. A chamber near the kitchens was prone to sudden chills, no matter the firelight. A narrow staircase beside the armory made even the bravest watchers walk a little faster, without knowing why. The watchers didn't question these things, not because they feared them, but because they respected them. In a place so old, so saturated with memory, not all questions needed answers. Some things just were, like the light. There was a corner of the castle that never seemed dark, even without a torch, even when the shutters were closed. There was a faint amber glow, like dawn's breath on stone. One watcher tried to record it, brought paper, chalk, even mirrors. But the moment he focused on it, the glow faded. The next night it returned as if amused. Another watcher, many years later, left a small note there each week, just a folded scrap tucked behind a loose brick. Not prayers, not messages, just questions. Are you alone? Do you know the stars have moved? Is it lonely, being still? The watcher never received a reply, but once the brick was moved ever so slightly, as though something had read and politely replaced it. When he retired, he told no one of this ritual, only smiled, and said the castle had good manners when it wanted to. No one laughed, not because it was strange, but because it was true. They all had a story like that, quiet, unprovable, undeniable. Because in that place, truth didn't need proof. It only needed time. There were days when the watchers didn't speak at all, not out of silence, but out of understanding. Their steps were enough. The rustle of cloaks, the clink of a lantern, the echo of boots on stone. These were their conversations. When they passed each other, brief nods, maybe a blink longer than usual. That was it. No need for words. The walls had already heard everything. Sometimes a new watcher would arrive, young, eager, curious. They always had questions, endless ones. Why are the west doors chained shut even though they still fit the frame? Why does no one sweep behind the throne? Why does the clock chime 13 times when there's no 13th hour? At first, the older watchers would smile, but over time, the young ones stopped asking. Because the castle answered in other ways. One night, a young watcher left his post to chase a sound. It was like laughter, soft, echoing, playful. He followed it through 3 corridors, down a flight of forgotten steps, into a room he didn't know existed. Inside, nothing. No furniture, no torch brackets, just air, thick with warmth, and a book on the floor. He picked it up. The cover was blank, but inside the pages were filled with his handwriting, things he hadn't written yet, dates in the future, observations he hadn't made, feelings he hadn't felt. At the very back, a note, "Welcome, Watcher. You've arrived." He placed the book back exactly where he found it, closed the door, never mentioned it again. But the next time he passed the others, he walked slower. His lantern hung lower. His nod lasted a beat longer. He had joined them. The ones who knew that some knowledge isn't taught. It's revealed in time, in trust, in silence. There was a hallway that curved inward upon itself, a soft bend so subtle you wouldn't notice at first. But if you walked it long enough, you'd end up exactly where you began, even if you thought you'd been walking straight. They called it the lantern loop. No windows, no paintings. Just torch sconces spaced every 6 paces. And yet, not a single watcher could tell you how many torches there were, because the moment you started counting, you forgot the number behind you, like water slipping through cupped hands. They tried, of course, with chalk, with pins, even with string, but none of it ever stayed. The chalk would vanish, The pins rust before morning, and the string would end up tied neatly in a perfect knot, at the very place they began. Eventually, they stopped trying. The lantern loop became a place of pause. Not fear, not frustration, just acceptance. If a watcher disappeared for a while, they were probably in the loop. Walking, thinking, letting the walls breathe around them. Some said the hallway listened. That if you spoke your thoughts there, they'd be sorted by morning. And curiously, whenever someone came out of the loop, they looked lighter, like something had been unburdened without ever being named. One old watcher entered the loop in silence one winter's evening after a cold rain. He emerged 3 days later, his boots perfectly dry, his cloak unstained, his hands holding a single copper coin worn smooth on both sides. He placed the coin on a stone shelf and said, "That's for the next one who asked the wrong question." Then he returned to his post without another word. No one ever moved the coin. No one ever touched it. But somehow, it was always warm, as if it remembered. There was a staircase hidden behind a mirror in the north quarter of the keep. But not just any mirror. This one was peculiar. Tall as a man, narrow as a wardrobe door, and framed in black iron that always felt slightly too cold. The watchers didn't dust it. They didn't polish it. They didn't even speak around it. It was simply there, leaning against the wall as if forgotten. But never actually forgotten. Because sometimes, if you passed it late at night, you'd see two reflections, your own and another, just behind your shoulder, motionless, patient. No one turned around fast enough to catch the second figure, but those who tried said the air would shift, slightly damp, like the hush before a thunderstorm. Eventually, someone brave, or foolish, pressed their palm against the glass. It didn't resist. It folded inward like water. Behind it, a narrow spiral staircase made of stone the color of ash. It only went downward. No matter how far you walked, no matter how many turns, you never reached the bottom. One watcher walked for 3 hours, another for 8. They both came back tired but unharmed, unable to explain what they saw or didn't see. But then there was Thomas. Young, clever, always asking questions he shouldn't. He entered the mirror one morning smiling and said he'd count each step. He never returned. But on certain nights, if you stood close enough, you'd hear a whisper from the glass. 267, 268, 269, and always counting. Some say he's still walking, still curious, still unafraid. But the mirror no longer accepts hands, not even fingertips. Now it reflects only the watcher who asks no questions, who walks past without looking too long, without wondering. And perhaps that's for the best. Because if the staircase has no end, then neither does the fall. The ceiling in the southern hallway was painted with a night sky. Not in broad strokes, not with stars flung like sugar, but with precision so exact, so eerily perfect, that even scholars from the capital couldn't replicate it. Each star was in its place. Each constellation, true to the season it should appear in. The ceiling changed with the months, not magically, but silently, accurately. They tested the stones. They studied the pigments. They measured light angles, even scraped fragments for chemical analysis. Nothing explained it. It was always right, and only the watchers walked beneath it. They moved slowly, in rhythm with something unseen, as if keeping time with a celestial clock only they could hear. One night, an apprentice guard, eager, reckless, stood beneath the ceiling and whispered his name aloud, as if the stars above might listen. They did. The lights in the hallway flickered. The air grew cold, and for the briefest second, he saw his own face reflected among the constellations. A glittering outline stretched across the sky, blinking once, then gone. He never returned to that hallway, refused to speak of what he saw, but he aged quickly after, hair graying within weeks, eyes always searching the sky as though afraid it might look back. The watchers never acknowledged the change. They walked that hall as they always had, measured, mute, beneath a sky that never erred. And still, every season it shifts. a perfect mirror of the stars above, or perhaps a warning of what's to come. There was a room without walls. They called it the inner silence, tucked at the core of the old western wing, past corridors that no longer had doors, beyond arches sealed off by time. It was not marked on any blueprint, not mentioned in any journal, not included in any count of rooms. But the watchers visited it every third month at precisely the same hour. 3:33 a.m. Always alone, always silent. No one ever saw them enter it, and no one ever saw them leave. The room had no doors, no windows, and yet inside, somehow, there was air, movement, even sound, though no one could agree on what it was. Some said it was a whispering. Others heard music. One scholar, who stayed behind after curfew to try to record the room's vibration, described it as the sound of forgotten prayers. He wept the entire night. Not from fear, not from pain, but from an overwhelming sense that something was listening. The watchers never wept. They simply stood, one at a time, for exactly 3 minutes, with both hands pressed gently to the wall-less air. They would then bow, nod slowly, and leave the way they came, through no known entrance, back into the shadowed halls where no candle ever stayed lit. When questioned, if they were ever caught in that rare moment of hesitation, they'd simply murmur, "It's not a room, it's a memory," and walk on. To this day, architects and historians alike debate whether the room ever truly existed. But everyone agrees on one thing: the western wing is colder. Not because of the wind, not because of the stone, but because something lingers, something unspoken, anchored not in brick or beam, but in ritual. A ritual performed for 200 years by silent men guarding a room with no walls. There was always one final duty, a ritual older than the castle itself, passed from one night watcher to the next, not with words but with the weight of knowing. On the last night of the moon's last quarter, once every 7 years, a watcher would walk to the base of the oldest tower. No lantern, no shoes, only silence. He would climb exactly 147 steps, each one carved by hand, each one slightly uneven, as if the stone resisted being shaped, as if the tower didn't want to be climbed. At the top was a room no larger than a cupboard. Inside, a single brass bowl, a cracked window facing north, and a small wooden box wrapped in red thread. The watcher would sit, breathe, and wait. At 2:11 a.m., the box would begin to hum, not loudly, more like a vibration felt through the floor, in the marrow, in the memory. The thread would begin to unspool on its own, slowly, with almost human reluctance. When fully unwrapped, the box would open. And inside, a feather, an old tooth, and a folded note. The feather was always warm. The tooth, still stained with blood. And the note? It never changed. It read, "You are the last. Remember why we guard nothing." No one knew who wrote it, or when, or why. But every 7 years, a new note appeared, in the same curled ink, the same faded parchment, always waiting in that red-threaded box. No watcher ever spoke of the ritual, not even to each other. But each time the cycle came around, the chosen one would already know it was their turn, not because someone told them, but because the walls would whisper it as they walked. This was how the castle endured, not by strength, or walls, or history, but by the quiet watch of those who protected something no one could name. And perhaps that was the point. If you're still awake, you've just walked alongside those forgotten men, the silent guardians of empty halls. May your night be calm, your room still, and may the watchers keep their gentle vigil just outside the edge of your dreams. Good night.